Book 3. The Council of the Ages. Chapter 2.
The stability provided by the great kingdom of Baudalania to its allies made development and economic prosperity spread throughout the continent. History of the Kingdoms of Nilish. Author Baron Lahamian. Once Loranthas confirmed to the elven emissaries that the Blue Phoenix Company accepted his request. The elves gave the chest full of gold from the First Age to Deboke as promised. Then they insisted again that they must leave as soon as possible. So they hurriedly made preparations for the trip. The insistence that it was only the mercenaries who had defeated the evil mage in Tripulia made the selection of the group easy. But Deboke would not fully comply with the wishes of the elves. The original group would be joined by 2 more mercenaries. The half-elf Loranthas. Deboke did not trust his mercenaries of Orc blood, nor Gosberg. This decision was his alone. He trusted that with the presence of the half-elf he would calm the spirits and be a good interlocutor with the elves. The other new member was the dwarf Tanya, at the express request of Gosberg. Arian and Aris said goodbye to their daughter, who was left in the care of the priestess Anthra. Gosberg was happy about the trip. However, the orc-blooded ones were not as enthusiastic as the rest of their companions. Above all, Agnoric, who distrusted the intentions of the elves. Neither did Aris, since the great king of the elves had his father's head exposed as a trophy and left it to rot in the sun as revenge for the fall of Tortanel. Although the conflict had been going on for a long time, for millennia the orcs had been driven from their sacred lands by the elves. Now they would be the first orcs to set foot on the sacred ground again. They embarked 5 days after the arrival of the elven embassy. They did so before dawn to avoid a large crowd of people. Only a small group of mercenaries commanded by Deboke, Silkery and Arian's daughter with Anthra came to see them off. They carried their weapons, although in principle they would not have to fight, but you never know. They were received in a cold manner by the elves. Only the captain of the ship, Dorindas, a knight of the Order of Ellen, addressed them. The rest of the crew completely ignored them. The cabins had all the possible comforts for a warship. There was even a spacious hold so that Sabu could be in a comfortable way. The ship was very similar to Labres, but much larger. They knew very well who they had to transport. Aris, Kush and Arian said goodbye to Deboke for the last time. The ship cast off. From the deck they watched as Deboke and the others slowly disappeared into the darkness of the late night. The ship was sailing through the waters at an extraordinary speed. It seemed to float above her. Agnoric was leaning on the stern of the ship watching Almera disappear from his eyes, while the sun rose on the horizon illuminating everything. The dwarf approached the half-orc. The captain orders that we had better go down to the cabins to rest. Agnoric looked at Tanya with some disbelief. He wasn't bothering anyone. More than guests, we seem like prisoners. The dwarf did not reply to the half-orc. Agnoric spat into the sea. This is bullshit. Reluctantly he escorted the dwarf to their assigned cabins. They could not say that the trip was unpleasant. The cabins were comfortable. The ship moved quickly and was very stable despite the waves. The food was more than decent and the weather pleasant. But the treatment of the elves was very cold, even rude on most occasions. They never spoke to the mercenaries, except for the captain of the ship, and the sentences he used were the minimum necessary and brief. Even Tanya noticed the way they looked at Agnoric, Aris, and their cousins. It was one of sheer contempt. Of course, there was never the slightest provocation from the elves and the treatment was always the right one. But it was more than evident that this mission was not to their liking at all. Aris, thanks to Arian's persuasion, took it more calmly, but Agnoric and his cousins tried to avoid the elves as much as possible, something difficult on a ship. They went out on deck as little as possible, just enough to get some air, especially early in the morning and late at night, which was when there were fewer elves on the deck. The rest of the time was spent sleeping, playing cards against the Denka or keeping Sabu company, since the poor thing was much more limited in his movements. Agnoric also wrote something in his notebook. **********.
One day halfway through the journey, tired of playing cards and losing, the half-orc discovered Tanya's secret. The dwarf was in her cabin writing in a book that the half-orc had not seen among his belongings. "Where did you get that book?" Agnorok asked. The truth is that it was a volume that attracted attention for its binding rich in gold and stones that sounded familiar to the half-orc. Tanya closed the book where she was writing when she saw the half-orc enter. He spoke with a certain modesty. "It's a diary, my father gave it to me at birth. I thought your father hated you. He ordered it before I was born and found out that I was cursed by the mark of Abzorim. It is not a normal book." Agnorok, as a good adventurer, had an eye for valuables, if Kush ever sees him. Tanya smiled. The dwarf ran her hand over the cover of the book. A ring that the dwarf had on her ring finger of her right hand flashed and the book disappeared before the eyes of a surprised half-orc. "It's a diary of life." "A diary of life." "It is a tradition of the firstborn of the Gemenegra house. From the moment you are born they give you a ring in which it is associated with a book. It's a diary, in which you write whatever you want. At the end of your days when you die, the ring is removed from your hand and the book is deposited in a library in the Royal Mausoleum of the Black Gems." "But have you been disowned?" Tanya put her hand to the ring. "Once the spell is cast it cannot be overridden. My mother put the ring on me even though my father threw it on the floor in anger when he saw my face." "And you write?" "What am I going to do? Cut my finger. I have enough with being deformed. Besides, it doesn't matter, when I die no one will care what I have written. At least by writing I can be free since no one is going to read it." "Reading?" "Yes, it is a tradition on the Dragon Ridge. When he died, the following year the diaries of the Black Gem Kings were published. I think they probably omit things, but I would be embarrassed if someone read my thoughts. That would only happen if you were queen. It's never going to happen." There was a certain bitterness in the dwarf's words as she slammed the ring against the glass of the cabin window. Agnorok left Tanya alone again to lie down on her bed, sleeping, and the hours passed faster. 2 days later they sighted the islands of the Puente Archipelago. It was said that in the past they were the foundations of the gigantic bridges that link the different continents. Now only a vague memory remained. On the 5th day of the crossing they skirted the Cape of Sarmani, going up the coast until they reached the Bay of the Blue Moon, where they saw the port of the city of Panan. They all went out to the deck. None of them had been to this eastern area of Nilish since only those who had elf or human blood were welcome. Only dwarfs were moderately tolerated as long as they came to trade with interesting prices. None of them, except critters, since the Brown Hills were located to the east of the continent and perhaps Gosberg knew these kingdoms of Nilish. The port of Panan was protected by a wall and a large arch through which ships had to pass. But the entrance was protected by an island on which a fort had been built. The elf ship anchored in a port on the island. It was a mandatory stop if they wanted to cross the arch. The elf captain conversed with a number of soldiers. There were no problems and they continued with their march. They went through the arch, which reminded them of the Wall of Tame. Inside the bay there were countless ships anchored in a busy harbor. The bay was entirely occupied by buildings and dwellings crowded side by side and reaching up to the wall. The ship advanced with ease among the other boats heading for the bottom of the bay, where the most important pontoons were located due to the richness of the ornamentation. It was an area for the exclusive use of the elves, totally separate from the rest of the port. The ship carried out the mooring maneuver with total efficiency. A retinue of a dozen elven soldiers in their shining armor were waiting for them. But only one elf knight boarded the boat to meet them. The entire crew lined up to greet him. The elven sailors lined up and squared up in the elf's presence. He advanced slowly. He was tall. His long golden hair reflected the brightness of the sun. Cold blue eyes stood out and observed everything with a certain condescending air typical of someone who knows that he can handle any situation. The captain bowed when the knight reached his height. "It is an honor, my lord." The captain's tone was one of sincere admiration. But the great elf did not even deign to reply and addressed Arian. His voice was soft and calm, but the tone indicated a great condescension towards those present, as if the mere fact of speaking was a gift for everyone's ears. Arian, I have orders from my lord to escort you to our kingdom. The council awaits your arrival. We can leave whenever you want, replied the priestess tersely, a little self-conscious about the elf's attitude of superiority. My name is Zinnerak. I am the first knight of the Order of Ellen, the herald of Her Majesty. The elf made a slight bow with his gaze. For Zinnerak the only one who mattered was Arian. He completely ignored the rest of the occupants of the ship, as if they did not exist. Zinnerak disembarked first, Arian later, and then the rest following the priestess. Of course it was not the best presentation. It seemed that only Arian was the one they needed. The rest could sink into the sea and the elves would not care. He even ignored Loranthus, and even though he was a half-elf, it seemed that he was the same filth as the rest. They disembarked, and rather than being escorted they seemed to be prisoners. The truth is that they quickly came into the spotlight among the inhabitants of Panan, such a strange group with a Kendali, 2 Denkis, 2 dwarfs, and 3 orcs. It was too much for inhabitants only accustomed to humans, elves, or at most some dwarfs. But even Arian seemed too exotic to them, her wavy brown hair standing out against the teased hairstyles of the ladies of Panan. The company's clothes too. The color blue attracted a lot of attention in a place where reds, oranges, and yellows were what was fashionable. The elven soldiers made a kind of shield. Their mere presence was enough to contain the curious. Even so, the expectation they raised was high. It was evident that everyone must have thought that they were very important to the elves, since the Knights of Ellen were destined exclusively for the custody of the King of the Elves. They advanced along a wide avenue that ran parallel to an artificial channel through which the sea entered. This channel was not used by boats, or at least they did not see any, and ended on a large building, which, as Kush learned later, was the palace of the Duke of Panan, lord of the city. Although in front of that palace was the market, in which a building with a striking golden dome stood out, where the city hall was located. But for some time this building had only a nominal representation, since it was the Duke who ruled the city of Panan with an iron fist by order of the king. Despite the anticipation for their arrival, the elves remained aloof from the crowd. We must depart as soon as possible. The council awaits his arrival to begin, Zinnerak ordered. The horses were ready. They all rode except Sabu. Agnorak got on the elf horse and Tanya accompanied him as an extra passenger. As a good dwarf of the dorsal she had never ridden, and she was a little afraid when riding. Kritus, however, was already an acceptable rider. The company galloped out of Panan along the main track. They didn't look back. The road was of impeccable construction, wide and flat. It ran straight through the kingdom, occasionally glimpsing small towns or passing over one of the innumerable bridges that circumvented the mighty rivers that abounded in the kingdom. Although they advanced at a gentle trot, they did not stop riding until late at night, when Zinnerak ordered them to rest. They looked for a clearing in a forest, where they prepared an improvised camp. They did not talk much, since the elves camped somewhat far from them. Observing them from a distance, the mercenaries again felt more prisoners than guests. They had no food, they just drank some water and slept. They were awakened at dawn to continue the march through the kingdom of Visker. What they saw was a rich country inhabited by men, half-elves, and the occasional elf. At noon the next day, the elves stopped for lunch at an inn that seemed to be a favorite place for them. It was a richly decorated building. They had reserved a table in a courtyard in the shade of a huge oak tree. They ate at 2 separate tables, and the elves sat down next to some half-elves who seemed to be the hosts. Agnorak and Kush noticed those who were sitting with the elves. They were half-elves, but those who cleaned the tables and seemed to be servants were humans. In Visker it is those with elf blood who rule and belong to the nobility, whispered the wizard to the half-orc. But the truth is that the mercenaries remained silent throughout the meal. From time to time those at the other table looked at them and whispered to each other, something that made them quite uncomfortable. After resting they left in the afternoon with provisions for the rest of the march. They advanced until nightfall to spend the night next door at a ford of a river, and again 2 camps were made. Dawn broke and they resumed their step. Now the road was steeper with many ups and downs. They approached the mountain range of the Frozen Springs Mountains. To the east were the Shadow Woods, a cursed place for ages. At dusk they saw the Watchers Pass, a formidable fortress perched on a cliff. The only way to enter was through a double drawbridge that had never risen for centuries, as no one threatened the kingdom of Danair. It was the border between the kingdom of Viscare and the kingdom of Danair. They rode slowly, admiring the fortress that had never fallen to any siege. Its high and thick walls apart from the cliff made this fortress a magnificent defense of the kingdom on its southern border. The kingdom of Danair was not very different from that of Viscare, but the elven presence was much more noticeable, even though it was actually considered to be a human kingdom. After 2 days of travel, they arrived in the capital Danair, a beautiful town full of gardens and fountains. After a day's travel, they arrived at Danair's second most populous city, Tipia. They spent the night in an inn where they were able to rest in a very comfortable way. The road was of unbeatable quality and made it much easier to advance until they reached the Hill of the Gods, the border with the elven kingdom of Baudalania. And so they came to the gates of paradise and passed into the interior of Baudalania, where the orcs and half-orcs fell silent. They were the first living orc-blooded to return to the plains of paradise since the orcs' defeat and banishment. While the orcs were excited, the elves watched them with a contempt that they could not hide. In the background appeared the imposing silhouette of the Palace of Heaven. The Council of Ages was waiting for them to decide the fate of Shanaris.